Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today on hashtag No Limits. Hashtag No Limits is about people who society has placed limits upon, but who have busted through those limits. Ophelia says in Hamlet, "We know who we are, but not who we will be." And I believe that to be 100% true, and that there is no better example of that than the caterpillar turning into the butterfly. For those who don't know, the caterpillar literally dissolves into its cells and then it reforms into the butterfly. And then, as if that's not a difficult enough journey, it has to struggle in order for its wings to be strong enough to fly, for it to come out of the cocoon. And while none of that is easy, neither is busting through limits that society places upon you. I am your host, Shelley Kino, and today I am so honored and so privileged to have someone with me that I have admired and respected and who I have learned so much from early on in my career, and it has guided and shaped me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today and welcome Richard Lavoie. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Delighted to be here.
Well, thank you very much. And so, do you prefer that I call you Richard or Rick?
Rick is Rick is when I was a kid. Rick is fine. Thank you.
Richard is when you get in trouble and then you have to go to
Oh,
see.
absolutely, and they used it a lot, I'm afraid.
So I did a tiny introduction of you, but please tell everyone who you are, what you've done. Just give us a brief overview of your life.
Well, thank you. I've been in the field for 50 years now. This is what 50 years in special ed does to you, I guess. I started working in a residential school for kids with special needs, particularly learning disabilities and learning differences, in 1972. My wife and I were married and packed up our stuff and headed off to a school, and really kind of fell in love with residential education. When you've got the kids living at the school, you're able to make so many changes in the way they look at the world and the way they behave, and it's just a wonderful experience. So I did that for 17 years in Greenwich, Connecticut, and then took over as a head of a school here on Cape Cod, where I'm speaking from you now. Did that for 11 years, and the last 20 years I've been out on the road. I believe, as you do, I've taken a look at a number of your programs, and I just share your belief that we put limits on kids, we put limits on capabilities, put limits on skills, and many times they surprise us and delight us by surpassing those limits. And the problem that I have, frankly, is I kind of wander into the woods. I'm very much at the end of my career now, is that we're still fighting many of the same battles that we were fighting in 1972. There just hasn't been the changes we'd like to see. And maybe a good thing to talk about today is some of the changes that we should be making. It seems every field, our three kids are in very different fields. One is in medicine, one is a professor, and a drama professor, and the third is in nonprofit. And each of them have commented that their fields and their approach to their fields have totally changed as a result of the pandemic. The way they do business, the way they operate, their basic philosophy, and they've done a reset. And I'm not seeing that happen in education. And I'm really seeing the pandemic as being an opportunity for a reset, to change some things. I'm a big public school person. I believe strongly in the public schools. But if you hover over and look down at the public schools, we're basically teaching 21st century kids in 20th century buildings using a 19th century curriculum. And I think we need to make some changes in that, because when the system isn't working, the kids who get hurt the most are the kids who struggle. I love you use the word struggle in your introduction. It's one of my favorite words. Don't give me a diagnosis. Don't give me a whole lot of data. This kid is struggling in school. And when a kid struggles in school, and it's a tremendous impact on him. I was interviewed on NPR a couple of months ago, National Public Radio, and it's nerve-wracking being interviewed on NPR because, first of all, the guy who's doing the interview is smarter than you. I mean, it's a given. It's NPR. And the interviews are 17 minutes long without a break. Now, I've done a lot of radio interviews. I did one just the other night, but they're in commercial radio. So during the commercial, you can say to the host, look, ask me about this. You can kind of manipulate the interview. NPR, no, it's live, 17 minutes. And people listen to NPR.
Yes, they do.
you're in trouble. And we had like 2 minutes left to go in the interview. It went swimmingly, it went well. And we had about 2 minutes left to go. And the interviewer said, Miss Lavoie, if you could tell the American people one thing about children, what would that be? Well, let's summarize 50 years in 2 minutes. But what I used was something I think was timely. It came from one of my books, and that is that we need to come to the profound understanding as parents and teachers and caregivers that kids go to school for a living. It's their job. They do it 6 hours a day. And not only is it their job, in our culture, it's their entire identity. I say to audiences, think about this. You're walking in your neighborhood, you bump into an 11-year-old kid you haven't seen for a while. What's the first thing you say to him? Hi, Billy, how's school? Now, you might be with his dad for 2 hours before you think to ask his dad how things are at work. In our culture, we don't identify adults with what they do for a living, but we very clearly identify kids with what they do for a living. Hi, Billy, how's school? And so when a kid is struggling in school, when school is a difficult place for him to be, it attacks his entire personality, his entire identity. It impacts the way he feels about his dog, about his mother, about his parents, about his grandparents. It impacts everything in his life. And I think we need to come to that understanding that kids who struggle in school are at great risk for trauma and for depression and anxiety because they're failing at their job every day. If I had a job every day where I failed at most of what I was asked to do, the people I worked for didn't understand me, and the people I worked with didn't like me, I'd be pretty unhappy too at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a key point. I just had a similar experience. I hadn't seen my niece in a while, and I just got to visit with her over the weekend. And I don't know if it was the first question, but it was one of the first questions that I asked her was, how are things at school? Now, granted, I'm a teacher by trade. So, they kind of know that, when Aunt Shelley comes around, we're going to talk about school. But I think that's so poignant. And that is what I have always appreciated about you, is that you really speak to what is happening. You, to me, do for learning disabilities what Temple Grandin does for autism. Right. You explain it in such a way that it is easily understood in a way that I think those of us who don't experience learning disabilities would understand otherwise. And, I loved Fat City. In fact, I was just rewatching a few minutes of it, and I have probably seen that 24 times over if that's probably an understatement, honestly, because anytime I had opportunity to share with people, I would. And when I rewatched it just a few minutes ago for the little bit of it, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that person and that person and that person because they all look like people I know because I've watched it so many times. Yeah. Well, I know you've got Beyond Fat City now.
Yeah. Yeah, the Fat City was, for those of you in the audience who don't know what it is, it's a video that I did in 1987. We didn't think it would go anywhere. Quick story of the origin of it is that I developed the workshop, and it puts people who don't have learning problems in a position of having learning problems. And I play the role of a teacher who doesn't get it. And I stand over them and say, you're not trying hard enough, you're trying hard enough. And I did the workshop for years as kind of a way to give back. We were a young couple, didn't have any money. And so, I did that to local school groups and to parent groups. And in the audience one day, this gentleman was sitting in the audience, and he came up and he said, we got to make a video out of this. And I said, well, sure, give me your name, call my office. And he gave me his name. He said, I'm Bud Schiff. And I said, I'll expect your call. And I went to my secretary and said, if this guy calls, don't put him through. And I don't know, he's got a video camera to do something. Well, he chased me around like a demented basset hound for 2 years until he finally pinned me down. What I didn't realize is he was the CEO of the second largest insurance company in the country, and he raised the money to hire an Emmy Award-winning producer to make this video. It is now the largest selling video at PBS. It's passed out the Civil War series in terms of sales. It keeps discovering a new audience, which is amazing. Woman came up to me recently at an engagement, and she said, you don't look like your video. I said, well, you probably don't look like your 1987 video either. Give me a break. But it's really, and it did, and I appreciate the kind words about it. it came from what Janis Korczak calls, and maybe we can talk about Janis Korczak before we get done, but what he calls a moment of clarity. And it was when I was first teaching, my first year teaching, and I had this kid named Craig in my class, a wonderful, wonderful kid, tough, been through it all, he'd seen it all. And he was a residential student. He was about 13 years old at the time. And he passed in a composition to me. And I took it home that night and took out my red pencil and corrected every spelling mistake, every capitalization, covered the thing in red. I don't own any red pencils now, but I had a lot of red pencils then. And he came into class the next day, and he said, "Did you read my composition?" He was actually early for class the next day. I said, "Yeah, I did." And, all the things we say to soften the blow, the pump, you put your name, date, and day on it, and the margins were good and stuff. I said, "We've got to talk about the mistakes you made." And I took the paper out, and of course, this time it's covered with red. And I started going over the corrections with him, and I turned to him, and there was a tear running down the side of his nose. Now, I'd seen this kid get hurt. I'd seen him in fights. I'd never seen him come anywhere close to crying. And so I had the wisdom to put the pencil down, and I said, "Craig, you did a good job in this. We need to talk about this. Why are you so upset?" He said, "You don't get it, Mr. Lavoie." He said, "Last night the kids all went out to play basketball. I stayed in for an extra hour to proofread this. I thought it was perfect. I couldn't wait to give it to you. I couldn't wait to get it back." And I turned to him and put my hands on his shoulders and looked into his eyes and said, "The dumbest thing I've ever said to a special needs kid." I said, "Craig, I know how you feel." And he stood up and he said, "The hell you do. Don't you tell me you know what this feels like. You don't have idea what this feels like. Tell me you're sorry for me. Tell me you'll help me. Don't tell me you know what this feels like." And he stormed out of the classroom.
Wow.
Took a couple of weeks to get his trust back because it was such a stupid thing to say. And the irony that hit me that day, the moment of clarity that hit me that day, is most of us who teach have no idea what it's like to struggle in school. I mean, most of us who teach did pretty well in school. You got to be carrying around a degree, and most of us carry around advanced degrees. And why would you become a teacher if you didn't like going to school? So most of us who teach did well in school and liked it while we were there. So who's the kid we can best relate to? Who's the kid we can best understand? The kid with the captain of the football team, the head of the cheerleaders, the kid who was like us. And who's the kid we least understand? The kid who needs us the most. And that's when I thought, is there any way I can put something together that makes people feel for a brief time the experience of what it's like? And that gave birth to the video. And it's kind of crazy out there. It's just, I get 4, 5, 6 emails a day from people who are just discovering it, and wondering why people are dressed because like it's 1980, because that's what it was in 1980. But if you can get past that, and when I did a follow-up video called Beyond Fat City, and in order to do that, I sat down and watched Fat City, which I hadn't done in years. Why would I watch it?
Right.
And I sat down and watched it with a pad, and I said, I'm going to say, write down the things I wish I had done differently, things that weren't true in the original. And the pad was empty at the end. It's kind of classic stuff. Fairness is fairness. It was fairness in 1987. It'll be fairness in 2087. It's kind of philosophical, deep-rooted stuff that doesn't really change. And so, yeah, I appreciate the kind words. It's made a gigantic difference in my life. I did a speaking tour through Australia. And what Australia did is they've got a national curriculum. People move around a lot in Australia. It's part of the culture. And what they found was you'd have a kid live in Brisbane and his 7th grade science curriculum was weather. And then he moved to Sydney and the 8th grade curriculum was weather, and so they said, well, let's put together a national curriculum where all the schools are doing the same thing. So people move around, they won't lose anything. And part of the training was that every teacher had to watch Fat City. So, I'd walk into a restaurant and people knew who I was. It was very, very strange. But I appreciate the kind words, and I'm glad I did it. And it really has, for parents and teachers, I think it's made a difference. But the thing that means the most to me is when people come up and say, that was me when I was a kid. That's what I went through when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what means something to me. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did put up a website. It was a YouTube site because it's out there on YouTube as well.
which is
And
which is illegal, but that's okay with me.
oh, I'm sorry. So
No, please. I mean, believe me, if anybody's going to, people who are going to buy it have bought it. I'm embarrassed to say I gave it away as a young man. I was young and stupid, but I have no regrets because I think it's done the job and it's done a great deal for me.
yeah, well, I have a copy of it, and I also have I have like the probably original
Yeah, that's the original.
copy
Yeah,
of the book that
yeah.
it's so much work to be your friend. And so let's move into that a little bit.
Mhm.
I mean, like I said, Fat City and Beyond Fat City are incredible. And for anybody who has never heard of them or hasn't watched them in a long time, definitely go to PBS and get your copy of them. Don't go to that website that I just put up here a minute ago.
Oh, good. Believe me, that's all good. No, PBS knows about it too, and they're letting it go. I mean, it's
Okay.
been out there for do the math. It's almost 40 years, so
Yeah.
it's all good. But it also, the official name of it is How Difficult Can This Be? So if you can't find it under Fat City, you can find it under that. But yeah, it's gratifying to know that it is out there and still getting that job done. And just people will call me and say, I saw the video, but I don't know what to do now. I said, well, then it did its job. It's only designed to sensitize you to the kid. You're not going to learn in a 47-minute video how to deal in this complex field. But if it gave you the impetus to try to find that out, well, then it's all good. Then I did my job. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's such a key point. And I didn't realize as I'm talking to you, I'm realizing how much of your teachings are a part of what I do now. I mean, I knew that you had an influence on me, but I'm thinking there's just so many things that I have learned from you. And that's the being aware part is so key. In a lot of the trainings that I do, it is so much self-awareness. I train on behaviors. I train on writing IEPs. I train on in just anything to do with special education, honestly. And one of the trainings that I do, I have a segment in there where we watch a video and it's about overstimulation. And I got the idea from Fat City because I'm trying to have teachers understand just for a few minutes what it's like for somebody who is overstimulated all the time. Or, and then we do one on attention. And I have another exercise that I do for that. And it's eye-opening for them. And I think our own mental health has a lot to do with our expectations. And I think we have ridiculous expectations for a lot of our students. Some are way too low and others are way too high.
Well, I did a seminar like this with a group of college students. People were going into special ed a little while ago. And somebody asked an interesting question. If you could change one thing about special ed, one word about learning disabilities, what would you change? And I think they anticipated the answer, which would be to change learning disabilities to learning different. And frankly, I'm not one of those guys. I mean, Shelley, I spent 30 years in residential special ed with these kids, putting them to bed at night and getting them up in the morning. This is a disability. And when I speak to kids, I call it a difference, but I just won't join that camp of calling it a difference because it's more than that. I think it minimizes the kids' struggles. And I'm somebody who spends a lot of my time testifying to legislatures trying to get more money for these kids. We're not getting the money we call it a disability. We start calling it a difference and it's going to go away. I know it's more politically correct, but I honestly feel it's almost insulting to the kid who struggles with this very pervasive disability every day to just call it a difference. And I said, if there's one word we should change, it's not difference and disability. It's a verb. We need to change the verb in the minds of teachers and parents. We need to change the verb is to the verb has. It's not that the kid is a problem. It's that he has a problem. See, this kid by definition is going to take more time, more energy, and more resources from the teacher or the parent than the other kids. So the adult begins to think this kid is a problem. The core of special ed is a recognition that this kid has a problem. It's his problem. He's the one that owns it. And your job is to try to make it better. Again, those are the things that I was talking about in 1972. And I probably shouldn't be saying this because I don't know who'll see this, but I'm doing a very, very fine independent school here in the Northeast asked me to do an hour on learning disabilities, a seminar like this. And I said, well, okay, ask the staff what the questions are. What questions have they? And the things that I got in today, and there are wonderful staff who care about kids, but the most basic, what does ADHD mean? I mean, these things, we've done such a poor job of educating teachers in the undergraduate level about this.
Yeah.
I mean, we knew it was coming. The law was passed in 1975. I mean, we knew these kids were going to be integrated into regular ed. And just the training, the lack of training is really, really troubling. And it continues, I think, to be a battle that I fight all the time, is working with undergraduate programs to really put together special ed undergraduate programs that make sense for today's world.
Yeah, and that is absolutely spot on to a lot of what I'm trying to do. Behind me is is my book that I wrote, Those Who Can't Teach. And it's true stories of families who have gone through the special education process, or the individual who is going through the special education process currently. And when I wrote it, I didn't intend it to be for teachers. I intended it to be for anybody to have an idea of what it's like, in the lives of the families that are going through this situation, because it's different than mine.
Yeah.
The mindset is different. The perspective is different. The daily life is different. It's not bad.
Yeah.
It's just different.
Very different.
And about halfway through writing it, I thought, oh my gosh, like the stories that were coming, because they're all interviews, and the stories that were coming from these families, there were so many things that I was hearing that the medical field dropped the ball. The education field dropped the ball. Now, the medical field, they're at the beginning of life and, sporadically peppered throughout the child's life. But the teachers, they are with that child every day for 180 days every year. And outside of the parents, they're probably the people who are with the child the most. And so I started thinking about the marketing and how I needed to start marketing it to teachers once it was finished. And I've done a few book studies with teachers now, and they've all said this needs to be in undergrad studies.
Yep.
I would recommend this to every teacher that I know, because it is exactly what you said. We are doing such a poor job, even before the shortage. Now I think we're doing a worse job because we're trying to hurry up and get warm bodies in buildings.
Yep.
And I don't think that is really. I really struggle with that, Rick, because it's like, well, we need people there.
Yeah.
But optimally, we want people who are trained and who want to be there.
Yeah. And Shelley, one of my pet peeves is we're the only field that does that. When the only field that takes our most teacher aides. I mean, I love teacher aides. It couldn't survive without teacher aides. But here was the deal, the history of teacher aides. I haven't thought about this in a long time. Teachers in the 80s went to their school boards and said, look, we've got these kids with special needs in our class now. They take extra time and effort from us. We don't have time to focus on them. Please give us some teacher aides, some teacher assistants to come in and help us with the paperwork and, passing out the lunch cards and doing that kind of stuff so we can have the time to work with special needs kids. So boards of ed said fine, and they started giving us teacher aides. And what did we do? We assigned them to the special needs kid. That wasn't the deal. It wasn't the deal. And again, I love teacher aides. I don't know how we could function without them. But the point is not to take this kid, give him to the teacher aide and say, well, he's off my list. I don't have to worry about him anymore. He's being taken care of with all due respect and affection, by a warm body. That doesn't have necessarily any experience and that kind of thing. It's really, and again, we're the only field that does that. The chances of me, God forbid, having a heart attack and they take me to the local hospital, the doctor's not going to say, wow, this is a complex case. Get me the lady from the gift shop, and get, the lady. Right. I mean, and again, please, I will say for the third time, I'm not minimizing teacher aides or their importance in the program, in any program, but the goal was not to turn them over. And because there's now, again, as a teacher, I don't have to worry about it. He's with somebody, and now becomes a responsibility of that person. We need to be, don't like to throw around the word unethical, because I'm a very strong believer in educational ethics, but that's pretty close to being unethical. That wasn't the goal. That wasn't the role that we were supposed to have for our assistants and helpmates in the classroom.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I train on, is how to work with paraprofessionals and what a paraprofessional. So I train both teachers and I train paraprofessionals, and I say that to teachers all the time. Like, if you train them, there's a lot of things that you can expect them to do,
Of
but
course.
educating the child is not one of them.
Right.
That's your job.
Yeah.
You know,
but again, it's happening every place. And I would one more time say, we're the only field that does this, that gives our most complex cases to our least experienced people. If you look at that on the face of it, it's wrong. I mean, it's just wrong.
Yeah.
You know, you hit on something else too, that I think that is one of the, if I were king, I would change in our schools, is the lack of understanding of the parents and the family. I do a workshop for parents of kids with special needs, and it's called On the Waterbed, the Child at Home and in the Family. And I use the phrase on the waterbed because I make the analogy that a family of 5 is like 5 people lying side by side on a waterbed. When one person moves, everyone feels the ripple. And that's the way it is in a family. If one member of the family is having trouble, dad's having trouble at work, mom's having trouble at work, one of the kids is struggling at school, everybody feels that. And we don't get that because we're not trained in it. We're not right. trained in how to deal with the psychology of people who are in trauma or in crisis. It's not part of our undergraduate training. So again, I'm trying to do a lot of work with programs that offer undergraduate degrees in special ed and say, you've got to have a course in dealing. You see, what happens in undergraduate, we teach the students how to make clocks out of pie plates and how to make attractive bulletin boards, how to teach kids how to read. And then we throw it to special educators. Then we throw them into the real world, and we find they're spending 80% of their time with other adults. They don't know how to run a meeting. They don't know how to work with parents. They don't know, I remember one young special ed teacher coming to me. She said, I was there for a week, and the principal came up to me and said, I want you to do a workshop on autism for our staff next week. She had no idea how to put together a workshop. No, she should have been trained how to do that, because that's, in our modern world, that's one of the jobs of special education, is to educate their colleagues. And we've got to start training that so they come into the, like I said, so many undergraduate students have said, when I got dumped into real teaching, I realized most of the problems I had were dealing with parents, colleagues, administrators. The kids were a piece of cake. It was the adults that would keep me up all night.
Yeah. And when I left teaching, I taught for probably 15 or 16 full-time years. And then I've been in special education because I was a paraprofessional and as a sub. And so I've really been in it for 30 years or more now. But when I came out of teaching, the stress that I had felt from some of my gen ed colleagues, and I taught in very, very small schools, and it was usually just myself or maybe one other special ed teacher to all the gen ed teachers. And I was so frustrated because I was like, why don't they get this? Why don't they understand this? Like, I had to do a ton of on the job training to learn about how to teach my kids effectively. And I should have learned that in college. But what I realized after a few years of being out, because of a conversation that I had with somebody, is they get, when I think about how much training I went through as a special education teacher, and yet how much training on top of that I needed once I got into the field, and how much I continued to need all the different trainings and learning about special ed law and learning about the brain and how it works and all the different disabilities and things. And then I stopped and thought, how much minimal teaching a gen ed teacher gets on special education, but yet the law says you need to welcome everybody that it is appropriate, deemed by this group of people, that they should be in your classroom. Yeah,
exactly. With very little support. Or you said information or inspiration in terms of how the kid should be dealt with. And again, that's why the teacher begins to view that this kid is a problem rather than has a problem. And, I've been doing this for a long, long time. And, you'll talk to a teacher, particularly when the laws first began to change. And a great friend of mine was a history teacher. He was a genius in history, loved history, wanted nothing more than to be a history teacher. And he said, and I was special ed, And after a couple of years, we in the working in the field, we met, and he said, Rick, he said, no one's asking you to teach history, but now they're asking me to teach special ed. It's not what I wanted to do. And he was a good guy. I mean, he was a really good guy. And he said, I know I'm a good teacher. He said, I won history teacher of the year for the state. I know I'm a good teacher, and this kid's not learning. So it's not me. It's got to be the kid. And he sounds like a troll, but he wasn't. He was a wonderful child-oriented person who just didn't get that some kids don't learn in a traditional sense. It's a whole different ball, whole different ball game for them, and they just were never trained in understanding that.
Yeah. And I had a teacher tell me one time, well, if I wanted to teach those kids, I would have gone to school to learn how to teach those kids. And I was really offended by it. And was offended by it for many, many years. But again, then I thought, oh, it's not that, I mean, we're doing to gen ed teachers what we do to students. We're forcing them to accept things that they're not ready to accept.
Yeah. And I subscribe to that completely. But I remember one time, a number of years ago, somebody called and they said I was going to do some work for a school system, and it was a superintendent. And he said, Rick, some of these people just don't want to deal with these special needs kids. They won't deal with the special needs kids. And I said, are any of them 80 years old? He said, well, no, of course not. I said, well, then they got in undergraduate school, anything after 1975, they were told that they were going to have to deal with these kids. It's not like we just pulled this on them. They were told that it was going to happen, and they're acting like surprised. And then one time when I was doing Fat City very early on, I mean, I did it live for years, and it was great fun, but you knew who to stay away from. You knew there was somebody who was going to be a jerk, and so you didn't call him. And it was one of those guys, and he's sitting in the front, got his arm folded, and I was totally unnecessary in his life. And I didn't call on him during the workshop. And so at the end of the workshop, I said, "There are any questions?" And of course, his hand went up, and he said, I don't want to deal with those kids. And he turned to the new teachers at the beginning of the school year in the school system. He said, I'll tell you what you do. They give you any of those special needs kids, treat them like garbage. They'll go home and make their parents' lives miserable. The parents will call the administration, make their life miserable, and they'll pull them out of class. That's the way the system works. And sits down. I'm standing there, I'm a consultant. What do you do? And I said, you're saying you will not deal with any kid with learning disabilities. Yes, that's what I'm saying. You're saying you will, and you're willing to stand up in a public forum as a public school teacher and say you won't deal with those kids. Absolutely. I said, okay, what's it going to be next week? No Jews? No African Americans? I said that. He said, that's not a fair analogy. I said, excuse me, but it is. You're in public education, my friend. Public education educates the public. And you've got no more right to stand up at a public meeting and say, I won't deal with kids with learning disabilities than you've got to say, I don't want any Jews in my class. Those days are gone. These kids are protected by federal law. Now, did it change his life and his son came up? No, probably not. He's probably still miserable, and that was 30 years ago. But that idea that we don't want to deal with these kids, that argument's gone. But I think as special educators, we need to be sensitive to the fact that the special needs kid in a regular ed class oftentimes has a real impact on the teacher's self-esteem. Again, I know I'm good, and I can teach these 29 kids, great. This kid's not learning. It's got to be him. It's got to be him. It can't be me. And we're away from people understanding that on a regular basis.
Yeah, I swear I'm either living in your head or you're living in mine, because everything that you are saying are things that I have said or have thought. Because it is. I do think that drives a lot of that negativity towards students in general ed classrooms who have IEPs, is because the teacher, it's the self-esteem. They're feeling like they're a failure. They're doing all these amazing things for everyone in their classroom, and yet this one kid isn't learning. And so, well, it can't be me, because everybody else gets it, and I'm not going to change for this one. And I think it all comes from fear, honestly, whether they recognize that that's where it comes from or not, who knows, but that it is just this, I don't know what to do with a person who has special needs, because I haven't been trained on it. I haven't had enough experience. Whatever. And that's one of the reasons that I do this show, is to try to get people to see that we need to look at the abilities and put more attention on the abilities of a person. And yes, we need to help strengthen some of the areas where they're struggling, but that's not where our focus should be.
No.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well,
Right.
and that's the idea of the no limits, because
Yeah.
I had too many people that I worked with. And then when I did the book, I heard too many of their families say the same thing, that we were told, or the child was told, you won't run, you won't read, you won't have a good life, you won't get a college diploma, you won't
Yeah.
drive a car, all these can'ts, all these won'ts. And we just, we have to break through that idea
Yeah.
of setting that limit.
Yeah. Well, it's the magic of the word yet. I can't read yet. I can't
Mhm.
spell yet. That is in your future. It is in your future. And I think, it's an interesting thing. I do a lot of work with parents. And one of the things I became aware of is I was talking to a junior in high school, a kid with pretty severe special needs. He's fighting the battle on several fronts. And he said, my parents never talk about my future. I think they're afraid of my future. And we happen to be blessed with three very spontaneous, bright learners. They're all grown and gone now, but they're, very, very bright, capable kids. And I thought to myself, the number of times in a day that I gave them the message without really thinking about it, that they were going to be successful. When you get your driver's license, when you buy your first home, when you get married, without realizing, sending a message to them, you've got a very bright future. Things are going to be all good. And we don't do that. I can't counsel parents of special needs kids to do that with their special needs kid, to show that you've got confidence in their future. Because how can they develop that? They're being told there are all these limits, and how can they develop a sense of a positive future unless they're getting that from parents? You said you and I agree on most things, which of course means we're both right. There's no other explanation. We both agree with
Right.
So yeah, and I don't know. I find so much of my belief system being kind of common sense. And yet sometimes you spring it on somebody and like you just invented sliced bread, and I think that's why the training is so important. I'm a big fan of a guy named Tom Peters, who was a huge management expert in the 90s. I think he's passed now, but he was just a genius about management. And he used to say, the three solutions to any institutional problem are training, training, and training. We've got to continue our training. And unfortunately, in many cases, teachers kind of figure once I've got the bachelor's degree, it's basically I'm on glide now, and I don't really need to do much beyond that. And I could sit in my office here and read special ed research 7 hours a day and not keep up with it. There's so much good stuff going on, so much different stuff, so much stuff we believed in, we don't believe in anymore. And so it really is a responsibility of professionals to, keep their finger in the pie and keep reading the journals and doing that kind of thing. And it's not part of the ethic for many educators. And again, I say that with great respect, but it's not part of what they believe is their life. They kind of figure the degree is done and now it's time to be a practitioner.
Yeah. One of the things that I just recently have completed is a course based from my book, and it's teaching teachers how to collaborate and why it's so important to collaborate with parents.
Yeah.
As you just mentioned, all the research that's out there, there's so many different diagnoses of all different things now that qualifies a child for special education. There's no way any one person could know everything about every diagnosis out there. And so the parents are going to do that research, because most parents want to know, what is this that my child is struggling with? What is a learning disability? What is autism? What is ADHD? What is GNAO1 or this chromosomal abnormality? They're going to look at that, and that they can become a great resource for us, because we don't then need to spend countless hours learning everything. In my profession, I taught every eligibility at some point in my career. Now, there are still places across the country where, the schools are bigger and they do have a teacher who just focuses on kids with learning disabilities and just kids with autism. But I think in a lot of places that's kind of gone away, partially because of least restrictive environment. And you can't just say because someone has learning disabilities, they go here, autism, and they go here. But it's so important to get that information and to collaborate with the parents, because they were there before we got involved. They'll be there while we're involved, and they're going to be there long after we're involved.
Right.
And something that I heard from you many years ago that has stuck with me, and I still say it today, so I hope it's still true, is that You can count on one hand how many times parents came to you with concerns for their child's grades versus concerns for their child's friends or social skills.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's again, one of the great blessings of my career in residential special ed is you saw the kids 24/7. And I came to realize long, long ago that the biggest battle these kids fight is social. And the proof is in the pudding now, because we're finding that so many of our kids with special needs, we worked so hard to get them through high school. They went off to college, they come home for Christmas vacation freshman year and never go back. And 99% of the time, it's because they couldn't handle the social pressure of college, not the academics. And I've been saying this for years. The average kid in America spends about 1,080 hours a year in the classroom. And that sounds like a lot of time, but it's really only about 5% of his waking time. 95% of his time is spent in the hallways between classes, at grandma's house on weekends, at soccer practice on a Saturday. The overwhelming majority of the time is spent in social environments, and that's where they're failing. And that's where the depression and the anxiety comes in. And I think many teachers feel, or at least felt, that that's not part of their job. That, if the kid doesn't have any friends, that's really mom and dad's problem. My job is to teach reading, writing, and spelling. And that's why I tell those stories, is that, the number of times, and we've all had it, you've had it, I'm sure, where a parent sits at your desk and puts their head down on your desk and just sobs. Overwhelming percent of the time, it's about the social isolation and social rejection that they suffer, not that the fact that he can't spell. That's not going to bring parent to tears. And it's I think it's difficult for teachers to relate to that sometimes and understand that they can play a role there. And it's almost like you're wasting your time to work on academics if you're not simultaneously working on social skills, because the kid's not going to make it. I mean, I used to state this, Shelley, I'd state this as an opinion. I now state it as a fact, that the ultimate success and the ultimate happiness of a kid with special needs is far more dependent on his social skills than his academic skills. Far more dependent. And the research will bear me out on that. And that's why IEPs need to include that element. We need to say, this is part of our responsibility, is to in some way increase his social acceptance. I think I mentioned in the book you brought up, sad, sometimes a kid doesn't even know what a friend is. I was interviewing a kid was in the fourth grade, and I was interviewing him for admission to the school. He was sitting across my desk and his mother was sitting behind him. And I said, "Do you have a lot of friends in fourth grade, Michael?" "Yep, I got 7 friends. And I looked back at his mother shaking her head. "No, he doesn't." And I said, "Who are your 7 friends, Mike?" And he rattled off the names of 7 kids. And I said, "Why are they your friends? What makes them your friends?" He said, they're the kids who don't pick on me. His definition of friendship is someone who leaves them alone.
Yeah.
He doesn't throw my hat out the bus window. The kid who doesn't knock the cafeteria tray out of my hand. That's the kid who's my friend. The kid who leaves me alone. Man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right now, Shelley, you could sit down and list your best friends in fourth grade, and so could I. And under hypnosis, you could probably remember their telephone numbers. But that's an experience our kids simply don't have, and it has a tremendous long-term impact on them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. And again, that was something I think I learned from you early on. Well, I mean, like I said, I've got one of probably the original versions of that book, and it's the social. I mean, like you said, and we're doing a very, very poor job, even still today. I mean, I was just at an IEP meeting this week, and when I talked to the school about them having the responsibility to teach the child how to handle the distractions in the classroom, because they aren't always going to be able to just, walk away from it.
Right.
And they were like, well, he just needs to get used to it, or he just needs to figure it out. I'm like, no, that's your job.
Yeah.
Like that's why we're here. That's what special educators are supposed to be doing. Is, an IEP's purpose is for further education, employment, and independent living. So it's not just in the school walls and between the hours of 8 and 3 or whatever the school day is. And somehow we're still not getting that into teachers when they go out to be, in their undergrad. And I that's kind of, I think, been our theme today, is that we need to do a better job of training our undergrad teachers. But even as I said, and you mentioned too, the pandemic. And so now, before we had a mild shortage, now we have a massive shortage. And so we're just sort of throwing people in there. Like I mentioned, is it better to have the warm body or not to have anyone at all? And we're coming up with emergency certification, to get those people in there. And, I'm going to be a little biased here. My husband, I left teaching about 5 years ago. He went into teaching 2 years ago after being in the business world the whole time that I taught.
Oh, God
Now,
bless.
yeah,
Yeah, sure.
he teaches at a high school, but he can only teach business courses because they took all of his training in the business world and said, okay, this is your endorsement. This is what you're certified to teach. Now he's doing a great job. I'd like to say that a lot of that has to do with me, because he watched me all those years how to teach, and he heard all of my things that I said. And he does have me to bounce ideas off of and ask questions about. Now, he's not teaching special education, so he's not doing the paperwork and holding the meetings, but he does attend IEP meetings. And so I feel like, he's doing okay. And I'm not saying that no one else that had that emergency certification is not doing okay, but they don't have the same sort of benefits, I think, that he had. They haven't watched somebody who was a teacher all those years. They don't know what it's like in the classroom. They certainly, as you mentioned, don't know how to hold meetings, even if they're coming out of 4 years of undergrad specifically going for a special education degree. And so how do we fix that? How do we get into those undergrads?
I think we both said a couple of times it's the undergraduate. I say undergraduate programs need to have at least 2 courses in dealing with parents, understanding parents. And Shelley, I've been doing this a long time, as you have, and you get to the point you think you've heard everything. But I was speaking in the Midwest just before the pandemic, and this young mom came up to me, 7-year-old kid, Tourette syndrome. And I'm sorry, we in kindergarten, so he's younger than that. And she told me about a phone call she got from a teacher. Said it was a Friday evening, the end of his first week in kindergarten, and the phone rang, and he answered the phone and said, "Hello, this is Mrs. Jones. I'm your son's kindergarten teacher." And she said, "Oh yes, well, thanks for calling. How can I help you?" And she said, "Well, we had a speaker come through this summer who told us that whenever you call a parent on the phone, you should always begin the conversation by saying something kind and positive about the child. But frankly, I can't think of a single kind of positive thing to say."
Oh.
You know what the mom did? She said, "Call me back when you can," and hung up the phone, which is the perfect
Good
answer.
for her.
Can you imagine beginning a conversation that way? To say to another human being, "I've been with your child for 20 hours and I can't think of a single kind thing to say." Now, of course, that teacher is greatly in the minority, but that doesn't matter to the kids in her class that she's in the minority, that the teacher across the hall is better. It really is that undergraduate training where we need to sort people out. Some people aren't made for special ed. Some people know their content area so well that they consider dumbing down anything they do to adjust it. Maybe some teachers should, be excused from that. Not everybody's got the soul to do this kind of work. I got a brother who's the greatest guy in the world, and he does a lot of training, but he wouldn't be able to deal with somebody who learns a whole lot differently. We've got to start being a little bit more demanding in terms of teachers. Again, there's no excuse. You went into this knowing you're going to be dealing with these kids. The problem is that teachers, from the point of view of the pandemic, they were the heroes of the pandemic. I mean, good Lord, the people are baking cakes, and now all of a sudden the thing is just totally turned with all this talk about history education and education about race and sexuality. And I just know so many people have just thrown in the towel. They said, that's it. We carried the generation of kids through 2 very, very difficult years. Now we come back to school and we got parents yelling at us at meetings. That's it. That's done. I worry. And you talk about, in the state of Florida, they put together a law that said if you're a veteran, you can teach. No training necessary. You can teach in whatever, in business or whatever. They're thinking of expanding it to if you're the spouse of a veteran. What does being the spouse of a veteran give you any skills or knowledge toward being a teacher.
Yeah. Why do we have such a poor outlook about education? I mean, I'm thinking about for exactly what you're talking about. So in my experience, my dad was basically he was a jack of all trades. He was a phone guy, so he was always going in and installing phones. That was like his main employment, but he could also do some electrical work and whatnot. Now, occasionally he would have my mom work with him especially once he stopped working for a national phone company and started his own business. He'd have her come in and have her help pull wires and do different things. She's not qualified to go install phone systems on her own. She's not qualified to do some of the electrical work that he did. So why would we think if that's not okay, that it would be okay to the spouse of, I mean, that would have been like saying, well, my husband can go be a teacher because I was a teacher for all those years. I mean,
some people are going to be upset by this, but we pretend to be a culture that cares about kids. Kind of all evidence to the contrary. We live on Cape Cod. It's a huge retirement community. And you've got these folks, and they're probably good folks. I don't want to be too judgmental, but they're 75, 80 years old who come to every Board of Ed meeting trying to cut the budget in schools. Their kids have been educated. They don't care about the kids that they see in the street. They're retired. They want their taxes to be low. And you don't need a new school building. Again, we purport to really care about children. And yet some of the things that go on, you look around and you say, do we really? And if we do, let's put our money where our mouth is. I mean, I love studying ancient cultures that really did revere children. That I do a lot of work with Jewish, Orthodox Jewish schools, which is as far from my background as it could possibly be. This great thing happened to me a couple of years ago where suddenly the Jewish Orthodox schools are bringing me in. It's sometimes first Gentile that's ever spoken at their school in 100 years.
Wow.
It's a wonderful thing. They're embracing my work this way. But they have a phrase in Hebrew that says a child walking down the street is surrounded by angels saying this is the closest example of God. I mean, that's the way.
Wow. Yeah.
The culture feel about kids. We don't feel that way, and it's a difficult thing to say. And look at me scolding the world, but we put our money where our mouth is. I mean, there's people fighting free school lunches in New York City. They started a thing a number of years ago where every kid would have free school lunch, and there are people that are picketing. And well, they're kids, man. They're kids.
Right. Yeah.
What else do you do? And again, if you've got the soul for it, those arguments don't make any sense to you. But there's just some people don't. What can I tell you?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think about Finland and how their criteria to be a teacher is so stringent and so, I mean, they weed people out constantly. Yeah. And their teachers are still revered. Education is still revered in that country. It's not that way here.
Yeah. Yeah.
We lost that a long time ago.
But in some cases, we can kind of be our own worst enemy. I mean, if I go to the beach one more time and see a young teacher with a T-shirt on the three best things about teaching in June, July, and August, I think, really? Really? Right? And I think I love, again, I'm a special educator, married to one. My 5 best friends are special educators. But I think we did a really lousy job as a field in the 70s when as special ed teachers, we felt guilty that everybody else had 30 kids and we had 5. We felt guilty about it. So what we would do is go collapse in the teacher's lounge and say, you think it's easy? You think it's easy? My 5 kids are more high maintenance than your 30 kids. My kids are 3 times as much work. And we gave really lousy press to our kids, basically to make ourselves feel better. Right. And then all of a sudden we had to go to them and say, how about taking a couple of my darlings in your math class? And the regular teachers are saying, get away from me, lady. You've been complaining about these kids for years. I think I don't want to use the word blame, but there's enough responsibility to go around. I just hope that with the pandemic, schools have been bowing at the trinity of homework, worksheets, and lectures, homework, worksheets, and lectures. Well, okay, we went through 2 years where you couldn't use those 3 things. Mm-hmm. How to worked out okay. So maybe we ought to take a look at jettisoning those as being the trinity that we all pray to, and take a look at doing education differently. It'd be a great opportunity to do a real restart in education. Unfortunately, again, this latest political stuff which is a real hot button for me, is really turning more and more teachers off, and more teachers are walking away.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I totally agree that with the pandemic, we have an opportunity to do something very different. It exposed a lot of the sores, the negatives about education. And so instead of, trying to fix them, we're still trying to cover them up.
Right.
And we need to, and it all goes to what you said. I don't think we really, we get so focused on what's happening today right in front of me that we're not thinking about what our society is going to look like 10, 15, 20 years when these kids now are running our country.
Yeah.
And I get so incredibly frustrated when I hear that, teachers aren't helping kids with behaviors, especially the really severe behaviors, because, well, they're only in my school or my classroom for one more year. But as a society, we pay tax dollars, and I hate to, this is honestly what it comes down to often, is the amount of dollars associated to those kids. But so maybe you're not paying those dollars out now while they're in education, but you're going to be paying those dollars out when they get into society. The whole third grade to the prison pipeline. That just blows my mind that people are not more aware of that or even understand what it is, and why we need to help not make that the case.
I think it was Will Rogers over 100 years ago said, it's easier to teach boys than to repair men. That basically, if we don't get on the stick and do what we need to do with these kids, it's going to cost us in the long run. That's a difficult thing to sell to people. And again, as teachers, we tend to be very immediate in the moment and kind of lose sight of what's going on down the line. But I said we teach in 21st century kids in 20th century buildings with 19th century curriculum, and that's not an exaggeration. The Carnegie unit that's used at over 90% of high schools today, 40 minutes of math, 40 minutes of social studies, that was developed in 1837. They hired some Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie Hall, hired American education was in big trouble, and he hired a Swiss educator to come over and teach us how to do it. His philosophy was kids learn better in 40-minute increments. So that's been the structure of the high school now for, do the math, 200 years. 40 minutes, and maybe it's the best way to go, but we haven't looked at it in a couple hundred years. I was at before the pandemic, I was at a school in California, elementary school. Monday was science day. Kids did science all day long Monday. Tuesday was math day. Kids did math all day long. And the teachers, they had a waiting list of teachers a mile long, wanted to get to work there. But the school was tapped out in terms of parents. So many kids, it was working beautifully. Now, that's not for everything, but it's a different look.
Right.
And, better than the Carnegie unit, I think.
Well, yeah. And then the whole year-round school versus, the having the all of June, July, and August off and trying to I'm in the Midwest and we're all farmers here. And, but that's a big argument as well. We need those kids in the summer to help on the farms. Well, you'd still get them 6 weeks. It's not that we don't have summer break, and then you'd have them all spread out throughout the rest of the year, and they wouldn't have to miss school, or they wouldn't be tired going to school because they worked on the farm earlier or late or whatever. And, but yeah, getting that whole shift and change in philosophy, is huge. And I think it really needs to happen. And I think it definitely needs to happen for our kiddos that are eligible for special education. I really think, and that I should probably have you on for a whole nother episode just to talk about that. But I do need to say goodbye to you for today. And I have so much appreciated this conversation with you. I hope that people will, I don't know if I did put up your website earlier. I did put the YouTube link up, but ricklavoie.com. And Lavoie is Lavoie. So for those of you who will listen to this just on the podcast version, that is his website. Check him out. He is just absolutely amazing. And it has totally been my honor today to have this conversation with you and to have you on here. Last parting words.
We need to take a look at the decisions we make, particularly where it comes to IEPs. Do we have a couple of minutes? I don't want to go over.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I do a thing that gets mixed reviews, but I draw this example in terms of our responsibility to kids. Before pandemic, I traveled for a living. That's all I did. And sooner they come into town, the first thing I do is buy a local newspaper or remember to watch the 11 o'clock news that night because get a flavor for the community and maybe work something into my speech. And for those years before the pandemic, it was the same thing. I watched the 10 or 11 o'clock news. They do the sports, they do the weather, and they go back to the anchor, and the anchor would say, well, we got one more thing we want to do after this commercial, but get your tissues ready because it's going to be, we've been crying about this all day. We're going to show you a piece of film. And I think, boy, here we go again. And they would show a piece of film of a soldier or a Marine or a sailor returning from deployment after being gone for a year and a half and surprising his kids at an assembly or at a basketball game. Everybody's sobbing. The most memorable one I saw was a little boy, 9 years old, little league ball player. His dad had been deployed for 18 months. The kid showed up for a baseball game. He was a ball player and he showed up the game, and there's all these cameras and stuff around and news trucks. They said, they're just doing a documentary on Little League baseball. Don't worry about it. This little boy, 7 years old, gets up the bat. The umpire is standing behind him with a mask on. Pitch is way outside. Umpire says strike one. Kid says, what's this? I was outside. Second, way outside, strike two. Third, way outside, strike three. He turns to look at the umpire. He takes off his mask. It's his father. His father falls to his knees, hugs him around the legs. I asked the big question. Whose needs were met here? Whose needs were being met? I would submit to you, very well intentioned, they weren't the kids' needs that were being considered there. They just weren't. That kid it should have been, Dad's going to come home next Thursday. Let's clean up the car. He loves to have the car nice and clean. Let's make an appointment at his favorite pizza place. We'll meet him at the airport. Whose needs were being met there? And I think when we're doing IEPs, the one question I ask people to ask themselves when they're doing IEPs, whose needs are we meeting here? Did you just put that in to keep an administrator happy? Did you put that in to meet the budget? Did you put that in to satisfy an unhappy parent? Or did you put that in because it's what the kid needs, which is what your mandate is? It's just so many times when we make decisions about kids or for kids, we need to ask ourselves, whose needs are we meeting here? And again, I do that, and some people get upset about it because of the soldier thing, and I have tremendous respect for the military leads. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just that if you really examine that, it wasn't the kids' needs that little boy fell to his knees, had to be carried off the field in front of a regional television audience. I don't think that's what he needed. I don't think that's what he needed. And I think that the ultimate, every place I always worked, they knew. If they proposed a new program, I would put together something new. They were going to bring it to me. I was going to look at it. I was going to ask the big question. And the big question is, whose needs are being met? And that's a question that you really need to look in the mirror and be honest with yourself about it, because so many of the decisions we make for kids are actually making for different reasons. And that's not our mandate. So.
Yeah, it's so true. Again, we're so in the same area in our brain because I focus so much on, and the law does it. We have an individualized Disabilities with Education Act. We have an individualized education program. We shouldn't be worried. I was at a meeting this morning, and it was to get the permission for the parent or for the school to do the evaluation to determine if the child will be found eligible. And so the parent asked, like, well, what will happen if the child is found eligible? Like, where will the child be placed? And the principal said, well, we'll see, we'll determine what works for our district and then what works for the child. And I'm like, whoa, totally backwards.
Right, horse. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. But so that's as an IEP coach, schools don't like me because I am like, no, we have to do. I mean, this is why we have eyes in our law and in our program.
Yeah. And I worked with a principal not too happily who used to refer to IEPs as individualized excuse plans. And that's what he presented to his staff and wondered why the staff wasn't on board with putting together good IEPs. And that wasn't that long ago, Shelley. It wasn't that long ago.
It truly is mind blowing to me, honestly. And anyway, as I said, we could talk for another hour at a minimum.
Let's do this again. I really would love to. I've had a real nice time.
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely love that. All right, everybody. I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye bye.